Sorry, we're gonna have to start over. I knew that would happen. My phone goes to my computer, and I don't know how to make it not do that.
It's okay. Who knew that being a minister was going to require learning how to be a video editor, but
You can cut it out.
I'll cut it out.
Elizabeth
Yeah.
Bennett. Okay.
Well, and I'm going to have to edit I think I
Oh,
told
right.
you that I'm going to have to
Right.
edit all of these down just for time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, no worries. No worries. Okay. So deep breath. So, Catherine, thank you so much for agreeing to spend some time with me today. I really appreciate your presence. Um, and I was wondering if you could start by just sort of introducing yourself and talking a little bit about your spiritual journey and your life journey.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. Um, I am Reverend Catharine Clarenbach. I live in the Willamette Valley, which is a fertile and friendly land that has been home to many, many people over the course of hundreds and thousands of years. The Malala, the Kalapuya, the Multnomah, and the Clackamas, to name a few. And I began my life with my parents choosing which of the two churches, Episcopalian or Catholic, had the better music program. And the Catholic Church had the better music program in their estimation. So that's where we went. And that's how I became Roman Catholic. And I was very, very devout until much more so than my family, actually,
Hmm.
um, until I was about 17 or 18 when I had a crisis of faith and certainty that folks of that age are particularly good at having. Um, and that was in 1990. And in 1991, I met the first person I had ever met who identified as pagan.
Hmm.
I didn't know anything about pagan traditions at all. But Francie and then the person who would become my dear, dear friend for years, Randall, um, were part of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual Student Alliance. We did not include T's or Q's at that time, or I's or A's. And we um, met there, and they changed my life. I read a book that many, many pagan folks read early in their journeys and use for years called The Spiral Dance by Starhawk. And it was published October 31st, 1979. And it remains a really important text for folks to this day. So in 1991, I began my practice as pagan. And then in 1996, I began attending an interfaith pagan organization that had mostly pagan people, but also lots of unaffiliated people, lots of some Christians, some Jews, but mostly pagan folks in southern Pennsylvania. And it was there that I and several other folks founded the Stone Circle tradition of Wicca. Interestingly, around the same time, well, not the same time, a little bit later than that, I started attending Unitarian Universalist services at the Unitarian Universalist Fellowship of Center County in State College, Pennsylvania.
Mhm.
And then many years later, I moved to DC and started attending All Souls DC. So I was pagan that entire time, but also attending Unitarian Universalist um, services and classes and different things. And so I came into Unitarian Universalism already with an orientation that was very much geared toward, canted toward ritual, liturgy, candles, and what my father would call smells and bells from Catholicism or Episcopalianism. But because the leap from Catholicism to Wicca is not actually that big. It's not actually that big, right? We do some of the same things. But what appealed to me about Unitarian Universalism was that at my core, I have always been someone who thought that claiming the one true way was one of the most damaging things that religion ever did. At my most devout Roman Catholic times, that was still essential to who I was. And I think it's essential to Unitarian Universalism. It's also very important in most expressions of paganism. Paganism, by the way, is a large umbrella term, like you would say Christian.
Right.
Inside of paganism, you'll have various expressions of paganism, and mine is Stone Circle Wicca.
I'm really actually fascinated and would love to hear more about Stone Circle Wicca and how it got founded and how you differentiate it or identify as underneath the umbrella.
Yeah, well, it's actually a pretty interesting story. We were a group of almost entirely queer people, radical fairies and the sort of women's auxiliary of the DC Radical Fairies, of which I was a member. And there were trans folks among us and a couple of people who did not identify as queer. And we were brought together by someone who had learned what is called British traditional witchcraft, which is in the land of paganism, a more sort of conservative form, right? Sort of high church, if you will. And what happened with us is that from the very beginning, we found that the traditional to Wicca pairing of a man and a woman and a man and a woman around a circle, right, wasn't going to work for us. That was not language or theology that was going to work for us. And so it became clear very rapidly that what we were founding was a kind of Wicca rooted in eco-spirituality, eco-feminist spirituality, and queer spirituality. And so we talk a lot actually about how we're not a tradition that is welcoming of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and other queer folks. We are an LGBTQIA tradition that is welcoming to people who do not identify with those identities. So that's a huge piece of how we're different.
Well, and there's so many, I mean, if you think about different pantheons in different
Yeah.
cultures, like so many gods and goddesses are gender shifting,
Yes,
gender queer,
absolutely.
yeah.
It's funny, there's a story about it's Odin, I think, possibly Thor. I am not a scholar of Norse traditions, but who essentially does drag, right? And it's gods that we think of as very kind of super masculine in that tradition. And so it's sort of like even there's this recognition of the complexity of what it means to be gendered. And in fact, with Stone Circle Wicca, from very early on, we took the expression, the divine who is one and many, male, female, both, and neither. And that was in 1999 when we started that. And that came to us from the DC Radical Fairies. Now we talk about male, female, all, and beyond gender,
Mm.
realizing that even both, right, implies that there's only two. So that is something that, though we may engage with divinity that is expressed in various cultures, we have a special affinity, for example, with Inanna, the Sumerian goddess. Many of our members are devotees of Bríd or Bridget, the goddess from the British Isles, particularly Ireland. But we sort of return again and again to this concept of the divine that lives inside of all of us, that is within us, around us, and beyond us. A sort of panentheist approach.
And you're a priestess in this.
I am.
Mhm.
Um, we have what are called degrees in Wicca, and there's 3 of them. And when you are first with us, you're a student for 13 months. And at the end of that time, you may become initiated into the first degree of Stone Circle Wicca, at which time you are called a priest, priestess, or priestess of the first degree. And you are also called a witch. So we'll say Catharine Clarenbach, priestess and witch of the 3rd degree, which is my designation. And that trips a lot of people up, right? Priestess is not an identity that everyone is familiar with or comfortable with. We tend to hear about ministers or priests, or, in the Episcopal tradition, you have men and women who are all priests generally. But my role as a priestess is somebody who writes and organizes and leads ceremony, liturgy, if you will. We have services on the full and new moons and on the 8 solar holidays that happen roughly every 6 weeks. So it's the solstices and equinoxes, and then what are called the cross quarter days that are between those holidays. So I lead ceremony. I'm the president of the board of directors of our national organization, and I mentor new people coming into the 2nd and 3rd degree, and serve on our Council of 3rd Degree Initiates, which is one of our circles of governance in Stone Circle Wicca.
So when and why did you decide to go to seminary and get into formation as a UU minister too?
Um, I, wow. I was going to church at All Souls Unitarian Church in DC. And it was 2008. And I loved that congregation in a way that I had been surprised by, honestly. That congregation was once described to me as being very extroverted as as a congregation. It was a multiracial, multicultural congregation. It is to this day a congregation where people dance. The music program has always been really strong. The preaching was great. And I said to my wife one day after services, I said, I wish I had their job, talking about the ministers. And Julie said, honey, you can. You just have to go to more school and jump through a bunch of hoops. But so it was really about having had for some years and loving religious leadership and helping hold the mission of organizations who, or of an organization at that time that carried a care for other people, a care for the planet, a care for integrity of person, um, in the context of celebrating together regularly, right?
Right.
And so I went to seminary in 2010. And as I've mentioned, I was raised Roman Catholic. And then I became Wiccan, pagan for a minute, and then more specifically Wiccan. And so I decided really if I was going to be able to engage as a minister in the larger religious conversations in our culture, I needed to understand mainline Protestant traditions. And if I wanted to understand Unitarian Universalism, I needed to understand the roots of our traditions and um, roots other than the ones I was already participating in and sharing. So I went to Wesley Theological Seminary in 2010, 2 weeks after my father died, and he was a biblical scholar. So it was really, I went to all my professors and said, look, my dad just died, and my Bible professor in particular, I was like, I'm probably going to cry in your class for a while. And I did. Um, and it was interesting,
And
to
Wesley's
feel
Methodist, right?
Wesley's Methodist, yes.
Mhm.
Um, and yeah, it was a great time. I loved being in seminary, and I was very lucky. I had both a class in Unitarian Universalist history and polity and a class in Unitarian Universalist religious education in person at Wesley while I was there, and that was great fun. Yeah, it was really lovely.
So how has it been holding both identities, the Unitarian
Oh my gosh.
Universalist minister and third degree priestess in the stone circle? Sorry, big question.
Yeah, it's a big question. Um, I let's see, how has it been?
We,
Sometimes it's difficult to hold multiple identities in even in a tradition that works hard to be committed to pluralism, right?
right,
And so there are people who really feel like paganism, you can't be pagan and Unitarian Universalist, that paganism is um, inherently irrational, right? That we have an outlook that is not in keeping with the importance of reason and um, the humanist ideals of our Unitarian Universalist tradition. So sometimes it's been hard.
mm,
And then other times it's been great because um, I've gotten to do winter solstice ceremonies that people from many different theological positions have gathered around in a UU context to celebrate the winter solstice, just for example. And that was just a delight. Like, what a joy to be able to bring my experience and love for Wiccan ritual, pagan ritual, and bring it together with this community that was so important to me. So things like that were fantastic because there were always people who would come and say, I've never been to a pagan ceremony, right? I've never been to a pagan ceremony, and this was just lovely. And, you know, Wiccans don't proselytize any more really than you used to, though we may enthusiastically discuss our own positive experiences with our faith tradition, which I encourage you used to do as well. And it was lovely to see people engage with pagan ceremonies for the first time. Something else I want to say is that in Wicca, our cosmology, our theologies, our sense of structure, and what you would call ecclesiology in other traditions, or church structure, how one engages with congregational, you know, structure. I keep saying structure, are embedded in our ceremonies. So everything you need to know about Wicca, if you really did a deep dive into our liturgies over the course of a full year, you could learn by osmosis about what it is. And we don't have preaching in our tradition. We don't have an elevation of the word or an elevation of the purely rational in our understanding of what it means to be a human being. But we do things, right? We use fir branches with water on them to bless people as they come into the ceremonial space. We use, if we're outside, incense of various kinds. We light candles. When I first saw a chalice, right, a Unitarian Universalist chalice, I was like, oh, it's the union of fire and water. Like that was very clear to me. That was my understanding of the flaming chalice. And then I read a lot about it and I was like, I think I have a different understanding of this symbol than some people do, including the person who invented it.
Right. But not all that different. I mean,
Yeah.
you know, there's something about the union of opposites and the universality of the symbol. You know, the point
Hmm.
is for
Hmm.
everyone to recognize across
Yes.
tradition.
And the song that I associate with fire and water is called The Union of Opposites. And it's a chant that is very dear to Stone Circle Wicca's heart. So it's lovely that you said that.
One of the things that I say to my folks if they're uncomfortable with ritual is that the way I understand ritual is as when there's an internal reality that we want to shift, we create a physical manifestation of that in the world because it helps us shift that internal reality. And that seems to bridge the gap a little bit.
Hmm. Yeah, we talk a lot in my tradition about that ceremony needs to touch the mind and the body, the thoughts and the emotions, and bring transformation.
Right.
The four core ethics of our tradition are authenticity, integrity, compassion, and wisdom. And so we're always trying to have a deeper understanding of ourselves and a richer, fuller, more whole expression of those ethics in the world. And I invite you actually to look at stonecirclewicca.org, which has our three public statements. One is came about during the first expressions of the Black Lives Matter movement. One is about how trans folks are full householders in our tradition, not guests, not interlopers, but part of who we've been from the beginning. And one that was put out that is pretty amazing, if you ask me, um, uh, on reproductive justice, and that came out just before the Dobbs decision of the Supreme Court, after it had been leaked in May of that year. So we are a tradition that looks in and out at the same time. We have our own teachings and classes and private ceremonies. And we do a big fundraiser every year for a small nonprofit that we choose for that year. The event is called Red Dragon, and it's been going for 26 years as of this coming weekend in the middle of February 2024. And this year, for example, we're raising money for an organization that helps people with HIV with housing and jobs and, getting basic needs met in Jackson, Mississippi. So, and that's what I mean by looking in and looking out, both,
Beautiful. So, are there ways that Unitarian Universalism supports your Wicca faith or practice?
Interesting, because I have more often had occasion to bring Wicca into Unitarian Universalist spaces, or bring my Wiccan experience into Unitarian Universalist spaces, than the other way around. And I don't know that everybody would be that way, but that's been my experience. So I think some of the biggest ways that Unitarian Universalism has supported my Wiccan practice have been in what we call the pathway of the North, or the green pathway, which is the pathway of the person who goes to meetings, who who understands what it means to live in community together, and how to be together in community as we struggle with conflict, transformation, and the desire to live in love together. And Unitarian Universalism also has our struggles with that, but also has just gems of understanding about how to be together. And when I became the president of the board of trustees of Stone Circle Wicca, I found that my UU experiences, working in congregations particularly, were very, very helpful and very, very supportive. And I think I don't always remember that that's where and how some of that learning has come to me, but it's definitely been about bringing community together across differences. Because another thing I'll add, if that's okay,
Of course.
is as I said early on, the idea of the one true way is not okay with me. And in Stone Circle Wicca, we use a image that the late Judy Harrow designed, which is about, what kind of faith do you have? Do you see the idea of the divine or deities or other religious figures as archetypes that are useful to understand human experience? That's the yellow section. The blue section, or the blue, the blue section of the pie, is that you believe that there is a larger divine beingness in the world, the sort of tissue of the universe that expresses itself. I'll say this again. You believe that there is a divine beingness beyond the bounds of human understanding or the universe as we know it, that gets expressed in different cultures in different ways. And that's blue. And red is what is sometimes called hard polytheism, which is the belief that various deities have independent, particular lives, experiences, personalities that individuals can interact with, individual human beings can interact with. So we have in Stone Circle Wicca this kind of range from atheism or close to atheism, all the way to people who actively worship in a particular pantheon of individual deities. So just as a note of something interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. So what have been when you bring paganism into Unitarian Universe, your Wiccan practice and faith into UU spaces, and or your UU faith into pagan spaces, what have been the challenges? What have been the points of dissonance or friction?
When this actually hasn't been so much my experience, but I know it's been other UU religious leaders' experiences coming into Stone Circle Wicca, because we have a few, has been that it's, and we have this also with other religious traditions, but we're not an Abrahamic faith, right? We have some, we're a young tradition, right? People will tell you otherwise, but Wicca came about in the early mid part of the 20th century. Our work harkens back to and links with very ancient traditions, but Wicca as Wicca is pretty new, much newer than Unitarian Universalism is. And so UUs coming into Wicca sometimes find that they're unfamiliar with a tradition that has, in one of our liturgical statements, the goddess says, all acts of love and pleasure are my rituals. There is this kind of deeply embodied, immanent sense of human life, human potential, the divine, the world, everything is seething with life in existence. And so some UU folks who've come into pagan traditions and into SCW in particular, Stone Circle Wicca, have been a little not put off, but there's been a sort of moment of surprise.
God's frozen people enter into an
Yeah,
embodied,
yeah,
alive,
enter into the
vibrant,
body.
juicy space.
And juicy is a great word. I mean, it's part of what I love about paganism and about the Wicca I know and Wicca as I practice it, is that delight, joy, grief, love, sacrifice, offering, all of these are celebrated over the course of the wheel of the year, which is our season, the seasons of holidays. They're all there, and they're all consciously, actively celebrated in an ongoing spiral of time. But to return to your earlier question, challenges of bringing my pagan practice and pagan self into Unitarian Universalism have sometimes been the same thing, right? I'm a very juicy person. And that's not always how our congregations most appreciate religious leaders to be very honest. And at the same time, though, I've found preaching is a joy that I miss when I don't do it, and I love every time I do it. And I preach from a pagan perspective, right? So sometimes there's a challenge there of folks feeling a little shift depending on what they're used to in a given congregation, right? But I preached in early February a few years ago on the goddess Bríd associated with Saint Bridget in Ireland, and talked a lot about sort of things you may not know about the second most important saint in Ireland after Patrick. And this goddess, Bríd, who she's sort of springs from. And people said, well, we've never had a sermon like that. And I'm not sure precisely what that meant. I asked, but I'm not sure precisely what it meant. You know, it's just not in in some of our congregations, it's not the lingua franca of how we come together. It's not the common language. And so bridging language has been really an important part of being in either space when I bring something across.
Is there anything else that you would like to say or express or pontificate on?
Yeah. There's something that did come to me, which is magic, which is an important part of paganism. And in the tradition of Wicca, of which I'm a part, we talk about magic a fair bit, not as much as in some traditions, but it's an important part of my practice. Well, what does that mean? What is magic? And, we think of the art of illusion, right? The magic tricks. And I think we also often can think of magical thinking, the idea of trying to make things true when you're trying to make a circle square, right? Declaring that something must be true when it's not. Magic in Stone Circle Wicca is about living in the gray space between the poles of what I absolutely cannot control in this life, what I absolutely have control to affect materially, what's in between those things? How do we engage with times and places and spaces where I've done everything I can think of over here to get a job? And I know that other people are interviewing and I don't know who they are and I don't know how they'll land, but how can I shape my desire, my will, my self by engaging with my subconscious and engaging with symbols and practices that are embedded deeply into our experience as bodies and our experiences as human beings in general. I'm trying to think of a good example. I use the job one a lot. But so something I might do for a job search, looking for employment, is that I might I would apply for jobs. I would look for jobs. And that's all over here, right? And then I might take a bath with certain herbs that are associated with success or, um, security or home, and focus my mind on having a successful job search, right? And I don't know all of the elements that would go into that, but my subconscious knows a lot more about it than I do up here all by myself in my front of my brain. And for me, that's some of the most important work that magic does, is it transforms us. Ceremonies that are held in community are like the big magic, right? Because they transform us as a community and as individuals. And then the little magics are what we call magic. They're called workings sometimes. People talk about witches casting spells, right? And we don't do so much of that in Stone Circle Wicca. That language doesn't really always mesh with our sort of outlook, but magic is very important to us.
I've never heard it articulated quite that way, and it's really, I'm gonna have to sit with that for a bit. It makes a lot of sense, that gray space in between.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything else? Any last thoughts?
I don't think so. I'm delighted to have had this time with you. And as I said, if people are interested, you can find me and others and our fantastic statements of conscience at stonecirclewicca.org.
Sounds wonderful. Thank you so, so, so much, Catherine. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome.
Okay, I'm gonna stop the recording now.